But I said to my dad that I'm not going to speak to sand, referring to his ancestors. And looking back, man, that is disrespectful. That was childish of me. That was unwarranted. And I think that really, broke the conversations. And sometimes I think that the white wedding tends to, just be a splurge, right? If we have to be frank, it's not that you can't splurge when it comes to the traditional wedding, but typically, and what we've seen historically, is that people again would spend so much money when it comes to the white wedding, and people would enter marriage in debt, right? Why? Because you wanted to have the perfect wedding.
One, two, three, four.
What's good, beautiful people? Welcome to Two and a Half Husbands, where we celebrate becoming better husbands.
It's 2.5, even though there are 3 husbands, and that's because at some point, one of us, if not all of us, was not fully the husband that we were supposed to be.
And that's why we actually come here on a weekly basis to discuss some of the issues that we face, some of the issues we are seeing around us, and we hope that the journey that we started with you and for you is going to benefit you,
and yours.
Hey, what's up? Blaque Newborn here. Welcome to Two and a Half Husbands, where we celebrate becoming better husbands. Today, we are speaking about a very huge topic, and that is the conversation of white weddings versus traditional weddings. We're going to get into some definitions, clarify certain things, unpack certain understandings. But obviously, I know that this conversation is going to require more people to jump on and get their experiences, get their take on stuff. And so this is really just going to be a part one of many other parts that are going to come just from this one topic, from this one conversation. Right? So we're going to open it up, man, as the year progresses. Right? Again, we're going to try and get people from different traditional cultural contexts within South Africa, but also different countries, right? And how they do weddings there, and how they've navigated this tension between traditional and white weddings. And so, man, it's going to be a fun conversation. I've had so much fun just thinking through it, and also just thinking about my own experience when it comes to traditional weddings and the white wedding, right? So I think, man, it's going to be dope. So stick around. It's going to be a shorter episode, but this is just the beginning as we try and unpack this major, big conversation, right? And I'm so glad to see that there's been other people on the internet who've been speaking about it, especially people, our generation, and people who have gotten married recently or are thinking about getting married, right? And so this is just a pivotal conversation to have and to keep on the table throughout the year, right? And throughout the years, in fact, because there is a lot that is changing, a lot that is involved in what makes a wedding, and it's such an important step that begins at this big institution called the marriage, right? And it's something that we're passionate about on this channel, man. So you'll stick around. Let's get stuck in as we talk about weddings and how that impacts us as husbands in our journey of becoming better husbands, right? Part of what we are talking about today is really, when does the role of a husband start, right? When do you assume responsibility as a husband? I would assume, man, it probably starts the moment when you go to your future wife's family to ask for her hand in marriage. I think that's when it probably starts, So if you're a boyfriend, you meet online or whatever the case is, but the minute you say, I'm going to step up, take responsibility, and actually in front of my future wife's family, to step up, to man up, to take responsibility and ask for her hand in marriage, I think, man, that's probably, at least without officially getting the title, one of the responsibilities that demonstrates to the family, to your future wife, and even to yourself, that this is the moment when I'm stepping up and becoming a husband, right? So let's talk about weddings, right? We're gonna look at not even look at, but speak about my own story and why I did not have a traditional wedding, right? So I didn't have a traditional wedding, and yeah, there's obviously things that happened that led to us making that decision. So we'll get to that, but obviously we need to kind of unearth and unpack certain things that lead to the story of why I did not even have a traditional wedding, right? So let's start with definitions: traditional versus white wedding. Well, if we have to be very honest, when we use those terms, and they're used very generally to mean specific things, but I wanted to clear up some of those misconceptions, right? When we speak about traditional weddings, typically what we're speaking of are weddings that are done in a non-Western way, right? So an Eastern wedding, an African wedding, whatever tribe, whatever African or Eastern culture you find yourself in, so non-Western weddings would be somehow classified as traditional weddings, and anything that is white would be a Western wedding. But typically people have associated the white wedding with the Christian faith, and we need to obviously untangle a lot of things there. How did we even get to that? Why do people even mix Christianity with the white wedding? But honestly, and typically what a white wedding is a Western wedding, right? Whatever traditional ways Western people got married or conducted a wedding, that's what a white wedding is. And obviously, if you study the history of white weddings, it has to do with the dress being white. It has to do sometimes with the invitations, with the decor. If you go into the history of why it was even coined, the white wedding, right? But typically both things, I think, and should be, in fact, defined by their cultural practices. So a traditional wedding finds itself in whatever non-Western culture, and a white wedding is typically what would be defined as a Western wedding, right? So how did we even get there? Well, you can just do a quick Google search. Why did a white wedding end up being called a white wedding and being associated with Christianity? Queen Victoria and Prince Albert got married in 1854. And before her, many brides were wearing whatever color they wanted to wear for their weddings. And then she came and wore a white dress for her wedding, and ever since then the tradition kind of just stuck and kept, and people then started getting married, at least brides wearing white dresses, and so the tradition continued. In fact, again, just a quick Google search again, you'll see that white weddings have been around in Africa since the 1930s, right? So Africans have been wrestling with this question of traditional weddings and white weddings since the 1930s. But typically that's where it comes from. And Queen Victoria obviously identified as a Christian. She conducted her wedding at a chapel, and so I think that's where we'd also find just some of the connotations that marry Christianity and the white wedding. It's not to say that Christians before then were not getting married in quote unquote the building, the chapel, the church. They were, but I think then in 1854, it became a very big thing, right? So does the Bible actually prescribe people to wear white dresses and tuxedos for their weddings? It doesn't, right? It doesn't. But the Bible actually just gives us 4 principles in what makes a wedding, right? In fact, the weddings that we find in the Bible are cultural weddings. They're Jewish culture, right? People who in the Bible were Jews, and so their weddings were conducted in a traditional way that they saw fit as Jewish people. So there isn't anything that is prescribed for Christians in the Bible, and I'm speaking from the Christian worldview because I am one, and obviously that ties into the reason why I did not have a traditional wedding, and it's not primarily just that. Obviously there's a whole lot of other details that went into why I ended up not having a traditional wedding, but I just wanted to clear this up again. I don't want this video to become a video where we not debating about faith, but obviously it did play a big role in my decision and the conversations that led up to me not having a traditional wedding. But 4 things I think to just bear in mind. Well, the Bible speaks about civil law that has to be met for a marriage to be a marriage. So part of what the wedding is that we have to adhere to whatever the civil law is of the country that you find yourself in. Right? So I'm in South Africa, and we have marriage laws, civil laws that govern how we do weddings and marriages, and so that has to be adhered to, right? And then secondly, I think the values that both families that are coming together imbibe, right? And that's what you find as well in the Bible, that there's 2 families that are coming together and they have a set of values that they both hold on to, whether it's values about family, about faith, about children, etc., about worldviews, and so they have to uphold those values as they come together. And then faith, obviously, that's a big one. In fact, in a video that we released last week, we spoke about how, as husbands, we should be the custodians, or even the ones who are in charge of the family vision and the worldview that our family holds and imbibes. And so faith and worldview are a big thing, right? And then I think the last principle or key ingredient is the tradition, whatever tradition that you find yourself in, right? In South Africa, there's many traditional groups, Zulus, Pedis, Tswanas, Xhosas, Ndebeles, etc. And so there's different traditional cultural practices that go into a wedding. And I do think that there's enough scope and room in the Bible to give Christians anywhere in the world, and whatever cultural and traditional setting they find themselves in, to have freedom to embrace some of the good things and some of the things that are really beautiful. When I think about the attire that Zulus wear, I'm Zulu, that we wear for weddings. When I think about just some of the celebration and the practices around celebrating this union, those are some dope and good things that I think there is enough scope in the Bible for those who profess to be Christians to really embrace those things, right? And so with that in mind, how did I end up not having a traditional wedding, right? So what had happened is, because I was a young Christian at that point, and this is probably also just like a warning for future husbands. If you are going to have this conversation with your parents, you're going to be a husband, obviously. Again, you're going to have to uphold the worldview, the vision for your family. And so that starts before you get married to somebody, right? So as you show up to your future wife's family and you're asking for her hand in marriage, there's going to be things that you're going to talk about with that family, how you see the world, what your worldview is, what you understand about God, about humanity, about the future of humanity, etc. And so you're going to be sharing some of those things, man. But you are obviously starting and creating the spiritual climate, the vision for your family, and so you're gonna have to wrestle through some of these things, right? And that's what happened with me, right? That's exactly what happened with me. So I went, spoke to my father, and told him that I was getting married. I was thinking of getting married, and just a little bit of context: our relationship had been shaky, still is, and we hadn't just been on the same page for a long time. But again, I wanted to honor him. I wanted to chat to him about getting involved in my wedding ceremony and seeing how that will work out. Right? So anyway, went to him, had spoken to my mom before, and then went to my dad. And the reason why I spoke to my mom before is because I knew obviously there might be some clashes because of worldview issues again. And so I just wanted to have my mom be warned and be there as well to help if there was going to be any friction between me and my father. So went, spoke to him, told him what I wanted to do, and then he was like, all right, cool, let's go sit down with your mom and talk about this whole thing. So step one, right? It was cool. things went well, and we went and spoke to my mom. And then obviously we're speaking about the various practices that need to go into what a Zulu wedding is going to look like. And so there were many other cool things that we chatted about, beautiful practices, things that I think are super dope, that I had spoken to my future wife at that point about, so just even getting a new name as she gets into my family, wearing certain kinds of clothes and the gifts that we might have to exchange between the families, etc. And just the celebrations that are going to be there. Right? I'm from the hood, man. And you know how weddings are. It becomes like a hood affair. Like everybody shows up, and I was looking forward to having some of those things happen. And so we're chatting about those things. Those things are cool. And then we obviously got to the spiritual aspect of the wedding. And let me say this here, right? John Beatty once said he's a guy who lived a while back. Well, he lived in our lifetime, so it's not like he lived 100 or 200 years ago, but he's an African theologian, and he said it is hard for Africans to kind of separate spirituality from cultural practices. Right? It's like trying to get the white off rice. Right? It's just hard to do, and so there's always going to be tension. There's always going to be clashes when it comes to that. Again, I am coming in saying I want to uphold the spiritual vision for my family. I have ideas. I have ways, I have practices that I get from the scriptures, from the Bible, as a Christian, and so I want to raise my family, build my family on those foundations, on those principles, and so obviously knowing where my dad stands when it comes to spirituality, that was going to be a hard thing, right? Anyway, so then we sitting, and that moment eventually comes, and so my dad tells me that there's certain things that we have to do spiritually, right, as we conduct this wedding. And yeah, I flopped, man. I said something very stupid at that point, which I would, again, advise you. Future husbands, just tread very carefully and maybe seek advice as you go into those conversations. But I said to my dad that I'm not going to speak to sand, referring to his ancestors. And looking back, man, that is disrespectful. That was childish of me. That was unwarranted. And I think that really, broke the conversations, right? We both knew that there was going to be tension, but I should have chosen my words very carefully at that point, because it would have still at least given us room to continue having the conversation and see how we get to a compromise. But that was hard, and then at that point, my dad left, and I mean, there's other things that I'm probably not at liberty to share that might have led to him just making that decision to basically pull out. He pulled out of the wedding, and said that he's not going to be part of that, and so that was obviously a hard thing, right? But I think just treading carefully there, and he had said as a response that he knew some people who are professing to be Christians and who then find ways of how to really take in some of these spiritual practices into how they conduct weddings, right? And I found that to be very problematic. And again, I think had I had wisdom as well from older Christians that I had really spoken to, I think it would have helped the conversation become more richer between the two of us, right? But that was basically the crux, I think, of why, the whole thing collapsed. Because after that, there's other things that I think are not as important. So when you come from the hood, man, let's be honest, traditional weddings are not seen to be that valuable. Right. And I think that's just our issue. Right. That's our issue as Black people. I remember there was a couple who had probably, one of those My Perfect Weddings before My Perfect Wedding was a thing. And they had gotten into some money. The whole hood knew that they gotten into some millions. They had traditionally married before, and were obviously legally married. But now they got money, and so they made a spectacle, right? They got limousines, they got carriages with horses. They got helicopters. It was just nuts, right? They just blew money on quote unquote the white wedding, and I think that's a shame, man, for us as African people, right? To not value just some of our traditional practices, the good that's there, right? The beauty that's there. Again, if we think about what the traditional wedding and the white wedding is, those are just two cultures, and I think there's many dope things in our culture as Africans that we can embrace, things that we can really shed light on, even as we think about the future of our communities and the future of our families, and just who God made us to be as Africans. There's just so many dope things that we can embrace about ourselves, and particularly when it comes to weddings, and why I think we should actually probably just pause, even for people who are getting into the institution of marriage, that as a husband, you must actually just think, man, hey, what are some dope things that I should actually partake in, right? And wherever you are spiritually, that you would wrestle with that, whatever worldview you have, whatever faith you imbibe, that you would wrestle with that. But as an African, I think there's just so many dope things that we're losing, so many dope things that we are missing out on. In fact, a friend of mine was saying when we were having this conversation, part of the problem is the elders, right? The elders just don't tell us what is the way to do weddings in an African way, right? Certain people have different ways of doing certain practices in a traditional wedding, right? And that can also happen in one family, that there's one uncle who says we're doing it this way, another uncle says we're doing it that way. And so at that point, who do you listen to, right? Who has the authority to say this is the way that things should be done? But I do think because environment is changing, right? So some of the things that we hold onto traditionally, they worked in a specific environment, they worked in a certain environment, but we no longer live where we lived 500 years ago. We live where we live now in the urban areas. A majority of us, we live in the hood, we live in the burbs, we live in the city, and so our environment has changed, and so the way we do certain things probably has to change as well, because that's what culture is, the marriage between environment and people, right? And so that emerges from that is what culture is, and so culture is going to change. And so I think there's certain things that we need to probably embrace and change, just for the sake of actually preserving some of the beauty that we have, right? Not necessarily the practices, but the practices preserve the beauty and the good of us as a people, us as a culture. And so we need to come up with probably new practices in how we do weddings, just to preserve the good and the beauty of who we are as Africans, man. So I would say, man, as a husband, if you're thinking of getting married and you're an African, if you want to have the white wedding, it's cool, man. You could do that. And sometimes I think that the white wedding tends to, just be a splurge, right? If we have to be frank, it's not that you can't splurge when it comes to the traditional wedding, but typically, and what we've seen historically, is that people again would spend so much money when it comes to the white wedding, and people would enter marriage in debt, right? Why? Because you wanted to have the perfect wedding. But I think if we have the freedom to embrace the beauty and the good that is in our traditional African cultures, I think there would be a way for us as well, just to be very mindful in how we spend. Again, in African culture, which is a beautiful thing, is that when a wedding happens, it's a community affair, right? It's a family affair. And so I know in other African countries, which we don't do here in South Africa, by the way, but I know, I think in Congo and Uganda, Malawi, if I'm not mistaken, but families get involved monetarily, right? People contribute money together so that this wedding can be a cool thing. And I think we can come together so that we're not crippling the couple as they start their marriage, as they start off their new life together, that we come and we contribute together. But I think part of what contributed to that breakdown for us as South Africans is just these two major rivers that we live in between. That's the Western and African rivers, and we find ourselves in the middle of those rivers, man. And so we, in some sense, have become very individualized, which is a big trait, right, that comes from the West. And so then we start doing marriages as individual couples outside of the community, and we start doing life alone. Even with weddings, we plan them just as a couple, and there's no involvement from the community, from the family. And I think that tends then to, in some sense, give freedom to the couples, which has been a benefit, but there's a burden as well financially, especially if there's people around when it comes to family and community who will have opinions and want to contribute to how this wedding is supposed to be, but yet don't fit the bill, right, in making those ideas and things come to pass, because we can't just say, hey, this is how a traditional African wedding is supposed to be done, and here are the things that we need to get, and go off into the sunsets and figure this thing out yourself. I think then we're crippling just the couple, and we need to get around them with ideas, with ways of preserving beauty and goodness, but with also money, right, in helping them, because weddings cost, right? And so I think, man, there is a lot of things that we should be embracing there when it comes to African traditional weddings, right? I would still want to have a traditional wedding. In fact, we hitting 10 years this year, me and my wife, and earlier on in our marriage, we had spoken about wanting to do a traditional wedding when we hit 10. Yo, alright, guys. Hey, weddings are tough, bro. As we were approaching 10 years, I was like, do I really want the admin of having to organize a wedding and call people and have the stress of invites, the stress of pleasing this one, the stress of wearing that, the stress, yeah. But we'll probably do it, man, sometime, just as a way of celebrating how long we've been together, and just the faithfulness of our own community, and particularly the faithfulness of God over our lives. It would be dope. But these are some of the things I think I just want to teach my kids. I want to, kind of help preserve who we are as Africans and all that God has given us, and the beauty and the goodness of who God has made us to be, so that it really just adds to the tapestry of who we are as humanity in the world, right? So I'm Zulu, I'm Black, I'm in Africa, and there's a beauty and a goodness that God has given me that adds on to the beauty and the goodness of us as humanity across the globe, right? So yeah, man, I want to encourage you with that, and I want to say, if you're a husband, it starts there. So think hard and long about these things. And I would like to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Just put it there, man. Let's continue having this conversation. I'm going to invite some other people that we would further open this conversation and hear what are some other people's experiences when it comes to weddings, right? And see how they've done it, what we can learn from that, what we can glean from that, and what it is that we can incorporate, right, into our own families as we think about, future generations getting married. So with that said, man, let's not forget to subscribe, to like. Shout outs to everybody who's been subscribing. Subscriber count has gone up in the past couple of weeks. It's been dope to watch. It's been encouraging. It just tells us that you guys are enjoying the content. Keep sharing it with other people. Keep watching. There's obviously a lot of other conversations we're going to have as we continue celebrate becoming better husbands. All right? So we'll see you next week with a new episode. My name is Blaque. This is 2.5. We'll see you, man. All right. Peace.